It was one of those calm mornings where everything seemed perfect. The sun was just rising, the air was crisp, and I thought I'd finally get a moment to enjoy some peace with a hot cup of coffee on my own front porch. No noise, no rush, just me, my coffee, and the quiet of my yard. But that peace didn't last long. Out of nowhere, I noticed a figure marching down the sidewalk with the kind of energy that usually means trouble. And sure enough, it was Karen from the HOA, clipboard in hand, ready to stir up something that absolutely didn't need stirring. At first, I thought maybe she was just passing by, but the way she locked eyes with me told me this was about to turn into one of those situations. You know the type, when someone decides that being part of a homeowners association gives them the power to control every inch of your life. She didn't even say good morning. Instead, she went straight into accusing me of breaking HOA rules just by sitting in my yard sipping coffee. I honestly thought she was joking. But no, she was dead serious. She claimed there was a new policy about unsightly behavior in front yards, and apparently drinking coffee was now a violation. I couldn't believe it. Who makes up rules like that? And more importantly, how could they possibly think they had the right to enforce them? I sat there stunned, cup in hand, wondering how far she was going to take this. But then Karen pulled out a piece of paper from her clipboard, waved it in front of me, and said she was writing me a fine. A fine. For drinking coffee on my own property. And that's when things really started to spiral. I stared at her in disbelief, trying to process what I was hearing. A fine for drinking coffee? On my own front porch. The smell of fresh coffee was still in the air, steam rising from my mug, and yet somehow this moment had turned into a bizarre showdown with the HOA. I couldn't help but wonder how many people in the neighborhood had already been dragged into one of Karen's strange battles. She had a reputation, of course. Everyone knew her as the self-appointed enforcer of rules, even the ones nobody had ever agreed to. The truth is, I'd bought this house because of the peaceful front yard. It was where I pictured myself starting my mornings and winding down my evenings. Neighbors often waved as they walked by, and sometimes I'd even chat with them over the fence. It was normal, friendly, and part of why I loved living here. But Karen seemed to think my front porch was some kind of stage where everything I did was up for inspection. And now, apparently, even coffee drinking was grounds for punishment. As she waved that paper in my face, I noticed her tone wasn't just about enforcing a rule. It was almost like she wanted to make an example out of me. Maybe she thought if she could push me around, others would fall in line too. The strangest part was she kept talking about protecting property values, like my morning coffee somehow threatened the entire neighborhood. I wanted to laugh, but I also felt a knot in my stomach. Before I could even respond, she leaned in closer and said, "If you don't take this seriously, it won't stop here." And in that moment, I realized this was about to get much bigger than just one cup of coffee. Her words echoed in my head as I set my mug down, trying to stay calm. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear this wasn't really about coffee at all. Karen thrived on control, and the HOA gave her the perfect platform. This fine was just another way for her to push boundaries and see who would stand up to her. I couldn't help but wonder how many of my neighbors had already been cornered into paying for things they never should have been fined for in the first place. Later that day, I decided to quietly ask around. At first, people were hesitant, like they were afraid to even mention Karen's name. But after a little conversation, stories began to surface. One neighbor told me she'd been threatened with a fine because her welcome mat was too colorful. Another said Karen complained about kids riding bikes on the sidewalk, calling it unsafe behavior. It was clear that I wasn't the first target, just the latest one. And maybe, if I didn't push back, I wouldn't be the last. What made it even stranger was the whole board itself. Some of the members seemed to back Karen up, but others quietly admitted they didn't even know about half the rules she claimed existed. It left me questioning how much of her authority was real and how much was simply intimidation. The more I pieced it together, the more I realized this wasn't just about me enjoying coffee in peace. This was about the principle of whether a single person could twist the idea of community into something that only served their own need for power. And as much as I wanted to believe it would blow over, Karen's warning still rang in my ears because it was clear she wasn't finished with me yet. By the next morning, I could feel the tension hanging in the air before I even stepped outside. I hesitated for a moment, coffee mug in hand, wondering if sitting on my porch would spark another scene. But I wasn't about to let Karen scare me out of enjoying my own front yard. Sure enough, as soon as I sat down, I noticed her walking by again, this time slower, like she was waiting for me to react. She didn't say anything right away, but the way she scribbled something onto her clipboard made it clear she wasn't letting this go. Later that week, an envelope showed up in my mailbox with the whole letterhead stamped across the front. Inside was the official notice, a fine for public consumption of beverages on visible property. I read it 3 times, each time shaking my head in disbelief. It wasn't even a real bylaw. It looked like something Karen had typed up herself. But seeing it in writing made the whole situation feel more serious. And the final line was the kicker. Failure to comply would result in further action. That night, I heard voices outside. Peeking through my blinds, I saw Karen standing with 2 other board members on my sidewalk, pointing toward my porch like it was some kind of crime scene. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught phrases like, set an example, and show the rest were serious. It was clear this wasn't just about me anymore. I felt my stomach twist. If they were planning to escalate things, what would that even look like? A bigger fine? A public confrontation? Maybe even dragging my name in front of the whole neighborhood? Whatever it was, I could tell they were preparing for something, and it was coming straight at me. Just when I thought things couldn't get more absurd, a new twist hit me out of nowhere. A few days after that late-night sidewalk meeting, I came home from work to find a bright orange notice taped right to my front door. At first glance, I thought it was another fine, but this one was different. It claimed that I was now in violation of community standards for having unapproved furniture on my porch. The so-called furniture. My simple wooden chair where I sat every morning with my coffee. I almost laughed, but the more I read, the more serious it became. The notice said if I didn't remove the chair within 72 hours, the HOA would take corrective measures. That phrase sent a chill down my spine. What exactly did corrective measures mean? Were they really planning to come onto my property and take something that belonged to me? I reached out to a couple of neighbors who'd shared their own run-ins with Karen, and to my surprise, they admitted they'd gotten the same orange notices too, each one targeting something different. One family was told their bird feeder was not in compliance. Another was warned about leaving a garden hose visible in the yard. It was starting to look like a full-on campaign, and Karen was at the center of it. That's when the bigger picture began to take shape. This wasn't random nitpicking. It felt coordinated, almost like she was tightening her grip on the whole neighborhood, one family at a time. And if we didn't push back, there was no telling how far she'd go. As I stared at that orange notice on my door, one thing became painfully clear. Karen wasn't just trying to find me anymore. She was trying to break me, and possibly anyone else who dared to stand in her way. I knew the moment had come to finally confront this head-on. With that orange notice still stuck to my door, I walked straight to the next HOA meeting, coffee mug in hand, and took a seat in the front row. The room was filled with neighbors, many of whom looked just as fed up as I felt. Karen sat at the head of the table, clipboard in place, wearing a smirk like she had already won. When it was my turn to speak, I pulled out the stack of notices I had received and held them up for everyone to see. Then I asked the board a simple question. Can anyone here show me where in our bylaws it says I can't drink coffee or sit in a chair on my own porch? The room went quiet. A few board members shuffled papers, but no one had an answer. One neighbor after another began chiming in, sharing their own stories about Karen's notices and so-called violations. For the first time, people weren't whispering in fear, they were speaking out loud. The pressure built until finally one of the board members admitted what I had suspected all along. Karen had been drafting these rules herself and enforcing them without approval. Gasps filled the room, and you could see her expression change from smug to panicked. It was clear her power play had been exposed. The board announced that all her fines and notices were invalid, and just like that, the weight she held over the neighborhood cracked wide open. But just as I thought it was over, Karen stood up, gathered her papers, and with a glare in my direction muttered, "This isn't finished." And in that moment, I realized the battle was won, but the war with Karen might have only just begun. After the meeting ended, there was this strange silence as people slowly filed out of the room. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me before now stopped to shake my hand or pat me on the shoulder. It was like the spell had finally broken. For the first time, everyone realized they weren't alone in dealing with Karen's endless fines and made-up rules. The board promised to review every notice she had issued, and more importantly, to make sure new policies would only be passed through an actual vote. That alone felt like a small victory. The next morning, I sat back on my porch with my coffee, the wooden chair creaking softly beneath me. The sun rose the same way it always did, but this time it felt different, lighter somehow, like I'd taken back something that should never have been threatened in the first place. A few neighbors walked by and waved, some even laughing about how absurd the whole situation had become. There was a sense of relief in the air, as though everyone could finally breathe again. Of course, Karen's parting words still echoed in my mind. I didn't doubt she'd find another way to stir things up, but now the difference was clear. People weren't afraid anymore. The community had seen through the intimidation, and they were ready to stand together if it happened again. In the end, the fight over a simple cup of coffee turned into something much bigger. It wasn't just about one morning on my porch. It was about fairness, about not letting one person's control take away the peace we all deserved. And as I sipped my coffee that day, I realized that sometimes standing your ground is exactly what brings a community back together.